How can I use video games for academic research? If you're asking this question, chances are you either love studying and think games could be an interesting tool for research, or alternatively, you love games and you're hoping that writing about them could make studying a little more fun. Either way, you're onto something. The first games ever made were for research. Academics in the 1950s used games to help explore human-computer interaction and have continued doing so ever since. By the 1980s, research was being done on the potential for computer games in education and beyond. The first studies of games themselves, a kind of literary criticism of games, also began in the 1980s, with a book on Space Invaders by none other than Martin Amis, and an article in Glasgow University's famous Screen Journal by Leslie Haddon. Since then, thanks to the hard work of many academics and games lovers across the globe, games studies has blossomed into a fully fledged discipline. A better way to ask, can I use games for academic research, might be, what methods are there for using games? To that end, the majority of this video will draw on two textbooks that outline methods for studying games. While these textbooks are great for understanding the range of different possibilities for studying games, there's a lot more besides what's covered in these textbooks. As with any research methods, there are wider discussions about them, otherwise known as methodologies. I'll hint at these discussions in the talk, but the take-home message should be methods and tools for research are great, and it's good to have guides for implementing them written down. However, they are still open for interpretation. It's good to mix and match or to put your own spin on them if you think it will improve your research in some way. The first method I want to discuss is the formal analysis of games. Staffan Björk sums this field of research up by writing that the formal study of games is to view games free of the context of who is playing those games and when. That leaves researchers free to focus on the formal characteristics of the games themselves. A researcher that undertook some infamous formal studies of games is Janet Murray. In her 1997 book Hamlet on the Holodeck, she looked at games like Myst, analysing the appearance and presentations of the game, arguing for the narrative significance of certain gameplay moments. She draws attention to the formal characteristics of the game's endings, such as how in the pre-rendered cutscenes, characters will get mad at the player and imprison them should they make incorrect decisions. This stands in contrast to the happy endings that provide much less potential for interactivity. She provides lengthy, detailed descriptions of the game's plot, settings, and aesthetics before drawing the conclusion, the superiority of the losing endings of Myst suggest a basic opposition between game form and narrative form. How can we tell significant stories in a form that always has to end happily? How can we impose endings that yield complex story satisfactions on a form that is based on win-lose simplicity? Many would argue that computer-based narrative will always be game-like and that such dissatisfactions are therefore inevitable. But when looked at more closely, games and stories are not necessarily opposed. Murray's work is an excellent example of how we can undertake analyses of games that place an emphasis on the narrative aspects of games and makes powerful conclusions from analysing the games in isolation, applying what can be learned to wider discussions of art, culture, and society. It's worth noting that, back in the 2000s, not every scholar thought this emphasis on game narratives was a great idea. While still very much formal analyses of games, Nordic and Scandinavian researchers preferred to place an emphasis on games as playthings rather than as new vehicles for telling stories. For instance, in an analysis of Plants vs. Zombies by Lankowski and Björk, they highlight elements like the lanes of the game space, the spawn zones, and how the temporal characteristics that define these mechanical features, as in how fast enemies occur and where, defines the game experience. Their discussion highlights how these formal aspects impact the gameplay experience. Importantly, however, they note that while these kinds of descriptions are good for discussing design and the implications of design choices, for example, when one needs to provide critique to a work, they are not enough for the basis of a study. They highlight that formal analysis of game elements must support a strong central focus or critical argument. To that end, I could turn to any number of examples of papers written that study the formal elements of games in service of a wider and rigorously developed discussion of some social, cultural, or philosophical argument. However, I'll take the opportunity to do a shameless plug for my own work on The Return of the Obra Dinn, where my formal analysis of that game served to flesh out my argument that it commented on the complex nature of agency. In my study, I look at both narrative elements and elements that make the game function in its own characteristic manner, and analyse them in line with one core argument. Beyond formal analysis, we can also undertake qualitative studies of games. Once we begin to place our studies of games into a context, however, it becomes important to recognise players as individuals and as part of communities. In doing so, studying game communities comes to resemble ethnographic studies, where a researcher becomes immersed in an environment, or site, of players, asks them broad questions or observes their practices and takes notes of the experience. For instance, Tom Apperly, in his study of internet gaming cafes in Venezuela, discusses the rhythms of the players in one particular gaming cafe, Cafe Avila. He discusses the games the players played, how they played them, and when. He also notes how these situated players were able to use their varying levels of English in order to gain more paratextual capital, i.e., knowing more about the games by reading more widely about them. Apperly provides excerpts from his interviews, noting that one of the players says, "I usually try to search for this information on the internet rather than in a magazine, because in a magazine I cannot find exactly what I'm looking for. The answers and the kind of magazine I need I cannot find here in Caracas, so I go to the internet where I can find the answers to these questions." Studying these players in their own environment, he's able to find out specific things about them and to chart these observations in his research onto the rhythms of specific qualities of their play. Studying gaming communities, however, does not always require us to travel to specific geographical sites, although that is very interesting. Using methods like online ethnographies, where we involve ourselves with an online community as if we were another player, or else netnographies, where we use digital tools to harvest online data, can also be extremely interesting. Mia Consalvo's study of the community around online streamer Caseytron illustrates the complex and highly transgressive interplay between gender performance, expectations, toxicity, and satire in one specific Twitch TV community. Simply by taking rigorous notes of the live performances and comment sections, Consalvo notes how the streamer Caseytron performs in a way that invites misogyny, but also lampoons misogynists, while rejecting attempts from male viewers to be white knights, protecting the streamer while acting on the presupposition that she's incapable of defending herself. This complex and troubling study illustrates how complex online communities can be accessed and observed in entirely public and largely anonymous online spaces. Another method that can be extremely useful for studying games is autoethnography, or the practice of studying oneself as if you were a distant subject. This approach can be difficult to perfect and is in many ways in its infancy, but I highly recommend it, perhaps even in tandem with a close formal analysis of the game's elements. Ashley Brown notes how autoethnographies often take on confessional and impressionist takes, distinct from attempts at remaining impartial or scientific. They place a focus on emotion and experience. She notes an autoethnographic study of a World of Warcraft player in which the researcher writes, "I experienced firsthand the sensation of desiring someone through the game interface." Autoethnographies can sometimes lead us to uncomfortable realizations about ourselves, but the method can also produce staggering insights. Beyond formal analysis or situated studies, it's possible to investigate games by placing an emphasis on numerical or quantitative data. In doing so, game studies crosses over into the realms of disciplines like psychology or even medicine, as we can gather data from players by asking them to fill in surveys, or even by designing custom tools that track the actions of players. But I'll talk about that more in the next section. One famous, recent and excellent study in this vein is Matthew Barr and Alicia Copeland from Glasgow's Informatics Department, who studied the effect of playing video games during COVID-19 lockdowns. The impact of playing games like Animal Crossing and Terraria are recorded in longer-form qualitative answers, but the researchers also collated the data of their respondents together to chart the age groups, gender, and extent to which play has increased from pre to post-lockdown. One area where quantitative data is used frequently in game studies is in the field of studying links between games and violence, addiction, and aggression. A particular paper that used data to this effect was Boom, Headshot, that charted the correlation between gamers playing first-person shooters and becoming better snipers. It's important to note, however, this paper was later retracted after other scholars spotted irregularities in its data. On that note, I would urge a cautious approach to using quantitative data to explore complex topics. We want to avoid generalizations as much as possible, so while it can be tempting to simply chart the frequency of specific occurrences, it's worth tempering this with a mixed approach, blending in some long-form qualitative approaches too. One of the newest, most complicated, and most interesting areas of game studies research is practice-based, in which researchers develop games in order to gather data or else to explore longer-form questions. Practice-based research can be qualitative, quantitative, or a bit of both, but it presents an interesting opportunity to either collaborate with designers or to stretch one's own design skills. Games like Dear Esther and Walden were both designed by games researchers to showcase the potential of games as narrative forms. But it's also possible and extremely impactful to use games to explore more serious topics as well. In my own research, I designed a game with Ella Huber at King's College London to explore the extent to which we could communicate the efficiency of stem cell transplantation in the treatment of diabetes. The game, hosted on WattLab's website and funded by the Royal Institute, aimed to communicate complex ideas in an efficient way by setting different scores for different organs and asking players to find the most efficient strategy for playing the game. We asked players to post their answers to a Twitter page for results, although I'm still pretty sure I hold the high score. I took huge inspiration from Stefano Guleni's game Something Something Soup Something, which asks players to occupy the body of an alien making soup for humans out of ingredients they don't recognize. In this game meets thought experiment, it becomes clear quickly that defining something as seemingly simple as soup can quickly become complicated. Player data from the game has been brought together not just in an effort to find an excellent definition of soup, but to show how games can serve as effective tools for research. Finally, I want to mention the University of Stirling's own Power Up game, designed in conjunction with Hyperluminal Games. This game places players in control of the development of a sustainable energy solution, but takes the extra step in research design by actively tracking player actions in-game. Player data can then be collected, collated, and processed by researchers to gain an insight into our current perceptions of sustainable energy. This is a well-known strategy for effective design within industry, and is seeing increased use within the game studies community. In summary then, there are a wide range of methods we can use to make games work in academic research contexts. They can be the focus of our study as formal studies of games, or they can be the basis of qualitative or quantitative studies. It's even possible, and indeed quite common, to design games for research purposes, even to the extent that we can use games as data gathering tools. When it comes to studying games, the questions we can ask about them are practically limitless. Games straddle an awkward line between artwork, advertisement, and casino, and frequently blend all three together. The vast array of methods we can apply to studying games, then, is fitting to the wide range of questions we can ask about them. If you're interested in studying games, don't hesitate to get in touch with me, or to try and answer the questions in the Padlet connected to this video. I'm really looking forward to reading your answers, and hope we can talk about games and research methods for studying them sometime soon.